very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Welcome to JLF at the British Library. The next session is The Iron Wall, Avi Shlaim with Raja Shehadeh, chaired by Chris Doyle.
Good morning and welcome to the second day of the JLF London at the British Library. On behalf of our festival co-directors, NAMITA GOKHALE and William DALRYMPLE, festival producer, Teamwork Arts and the British Library, we welcome all of you to this session of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, journalism with a human touch. Our next session is Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, Avi Shlaim and Raja Shehadeh in conversation with Chris Doyle. In his book, The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, Avi Shlaim, Professor Emeritus of International Relations at St. Antony's College, Oxford University, looks into the Iron Wall method and traces the shifting policies of Israel towards the Palestinians and the Arab world at large. He argues that the state of Israel and its conflict with the Arab world will come to haunt history for years to come. It is, he says, a story of strategy and manipulation, of hostility and uncompromising nationalism. Raja Shehadeh is a human rights activist, lawyer and author of Going Home, A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation. In this fascinating yet haunting conversation, they speak to Chris Doyle and focus on the variations of the Iron Wall philosophy and how different leaders have employed the same to guide their understanding of Israel, resulting in unprecedented consequences. Avi Shlaim is an Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the British Academy. His books include War and Peace in the Middle East, A Concise History, The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, and Israel and Palestine, Reappraisals, Revisions, Refutations. Raja Shehadeh is a lawyer and writer and the founder of the pioneering Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq. Shehadeh is the author of several acclaimed books, including the Orwell Prize-winning Palestinian Walks, as well as The Strangers in the House, Occupation Diaries, Language of War, Language of Peace, A Rift in Time, Where the Line is Drawn, and his most recent book, Going Home, A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation. Chris Doyle is director of the London-based Council for Arab-British Understanding. He's a regular commentator on the region in international media. Our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org, and all of our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Do follow our handles, JLF Litfest, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can log back on london.jlflitfest.org or find us on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Please do get involved and comment and ask questions by typing in the comment section. We encourage you to help keep JLF London at the British Library a free festival by donating generously. It really will help us enormously in these difficult times. The link is provided. And please do support the British Library for all the work that they do by donating. Ladies and gentlemen, Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. Avi Shlaim and Raja Shehadeh in conversation with Chris Doyle. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Anna, and welcome everybody. The timing of our session today, combined with the caliber of our two guest speakers, should make for a really fascinating discussion. As you know, yesterday, President Donald Trump announced that Bahrain would be joining the United Arab Emirates as the latest Arab state to normalize ties with Israel. Of course, this follows the earlier agreements going back to the Egypt-Israel peace treaty and the Jordanian one. And we will see the Bahraini Crown Prince going off to Washington to join the signing ceremony on Tuesday with the Emirati foreign minister and Trump himself. And we've heard a lot of very highfalutin language. Donald Trump saying the sand was loaded up with blood. And now you're going to see that a lot of that sand is going to be loaded up with peace. Even great warriors get tired of fighting, and they're tired of fighting. So is this some great redrawing of the Middle East, peace in our time, or is this less about peace than the political interests of the leading actors involved? Trump and Netanyahu both electioneering, the UAE coveting sophisticated weapons deals like the F-35. And is it the betrayal of the cause of peace and Palestinians, the end of historic Arab position of land for peace and the support for a two-state solution? Will others join? Will Saudi Arabia? And does this mean that annexation of occupied territory, which has been on the table all year, is off the cards or just suspended for a very short period of time? And is the Trump deal of the century actually going to be implemented? Has it been resurrected now through the efforts of the likes of Jared Kushner? Well, I cannot think of two people I would like to hear more from on this, with Avi Shlaim and Raja Shehadeh. I have their books. I'd highly recommend Avi's book on the Iron Wall on this topic, and also a book that I thoroughly enjoyed, Raja's book on Palestinian walks, that shows so much of his love of the land and the people of Palestine. So if I could perhaps start off with you, Avi, that we have seen here this agreement, that, you know, if you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he will say that this is a result of peace through strength, the very thesis on which you have written about, the Iron Wall, and this is the only way to deal with the Palestinians, that you shouldn't negotiate through weakness and they will come around to you. Could you perhaps give us a little bit of a background to the Iron Wall strategy and what this means?
Yes, certainly. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you, Chris, and with Raja, of whom I'm a great admirer, and I've read all his books with great pleasure. So the background to the Iron Wall is an article by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Israeli right. In 1923, he published an article called The Iron Wall, We and the Arabs. And in it, he argued that there is no way that the Palestinians would willingly agree to a Jewish state on their land, because they were a people, not a rabble, and no people in history has ever agreed to make way for another nation to come and create a state on its land. So Palestinian opposition to the Zionist project of a Jewish state was inevitable and unavoidable. So what to do? Then came the part 2 of his article, which is a policy prescription. He said that the only way to realize the Zionist project of a Jewish state in Palestine was unilaterally and by military force. The Jews had to build an iron wall of Jewish military force. The Arabs would hit their head against the wall. Eventually, they would give up any hope of defeating the Jews on the battlefield, and then, and only then, will come the time for stage 2 of the strategy. And stage 2 of the strategy was to negotiate with the Palestinians about their rights and status in Palestine. So the essence of the strategy is negotiations from strength. And there is only one prime minister in Israel's history who has moved to stage 2, and that was Yitzhak Rabin when he signed the Oslo Accord with the Palestinians in 1993. But the Oslo Accord has collapsed, and looking back in historical perspective, what I would say is that the Iron Wall strategy worked. Israel signed a peace agreement with Egypt in 1979 from a position of great strength. And Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan in 1994, and again from a position of strength. So the essence of the strategy is land for peace. And in both of these cases, Israel traded land for peace. But in the case of the Palestinians, Israel is much more interested in land than it is in peace with the Palestinians. And that is the problem. And you kindly showed my book, The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. It's 900 pages long, but I can summarize it for our listeners in one sentence, which is that since its birth, Israel has been too willing to resort to force in dealing with the Arabs. But it has been remarkably reluctant to engage in genuine negotiations with the Palestinians about a settlement. And this brings me to today, when Bahrain is the second Gulf state to announce that it is going to make a peace agreement with Israel. This doesn't represent genuine peace, but it represents a betrayal of the Palestinians, because there is an Arab consensus about making peace with Israel. It is embodied in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, whereby all 22 members of the Arab League offered Israel peace and normalization in return for an end of occupation and the emergence of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, with a capital city in Jerusalem. These two last Gulf states are prepared to make peace with Israel without Israel having to pay any price, without Israel having to withdraw, without Israel agreeing to a Palestinian state. So these two peace agreements represent not a breakthrough in the century-old Arab-Israeli conflict, but a betrayal of the Palestinians.
Do you think other Gulf states may join Bahrain and the Emirates in a deal?
The key Gulf state is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, like the other Gulf states, has had covert cooperation with Israel for a long time, because the new enemy is Iran, and the new alignment of forces in the region is the Trump administration, Netanyahu's government, and the Sunni states, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states and Egypt, all lined up against Iran. And in this process, the Palestinians have been sidelined. So the Gulf states who are thinking of making peace with Israel are no longer insisting on a two-state solution. They are no longer insisting on land for peace. And I believe that Saudi Arabia must have given the go-ahead to the United Arab Emirates to strike this deal. But then they got cold feet, because the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, had arranged to meet with Netanyahu in Washington and shake hands in front of the cameras. That was the plan. Now he has pulled back from that plan. He's not going to go to Washington. He's not going to shake hands with Netanyahu. So I think that the Gulf rulers were surprised by the strength of the opposition to the Emirati deal with Israel. Bahrain welcomed the deal and is now going to go ahead, but we don't know what the Saudi next move is going to be.
Before I turn to Raja, which I will in a moment, what does this mean for Netanyahu? Because he certainly comes from a revisionist Zionist background himself, so he obviously is a believer in the Iron Wall strategy. And historically, in many ways, this is an extraordinary achievement for him, going alongside getting the American embassy in Jerusalem, the American position on settlements that now no longer sees them as illegal and so forth. You would think that he would be in a wonderful place, but of course he is in great domestic turmoil.
This is a triumph for Netanyahu, both the Emirati deal and the imminent peace with Bahrain, because he has never accepted the formula of land for peace. He comes from a revisionist home. His father was the secretary to Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and Netanyahu believes that the Jews have a historic right to the whole of the land of Israel, to Judea and Samaria, as they call it, that the Palestinians have no national rights. Jordan has no right to the West Bank. And so therefore, he has rejected the formula of land for peace. He rejected and he dismantled the Oslo Accords. His strategy has been to cooperate with the Arab states and to make peace with bilateral peace agreements with Arab states, to isolate and weaken the Palestinians, and in the end force the Palestinians to make peace on Israel's terms. But the mistake in this strategy is that the Palestinians will never ever make peace on Netanyahu's terms. Not even the most moderate Palestinian leaders would ever agree to make peace on his terms.
Well, I think that's a wonderful moment to bring Raja Shehadeh into this conversation, because as one of the parts of this Iron Wall strategy, Raja, is of course the creeping annexation. Now, in the Emirati deal, annexation was meant to be suspended. To remind our viewers, for some time now, the Netanyahu government has announced publicly that it wishes to formally annex other areas of the West Bank, having annexed Jerusalem, East Jerusalem before. So how do you see the Iron Wall strategy in terms of the creeping annexation, the growth of the settlements in occupied territories since 1967? You've done so much work on this at Al-Haq and written about it so eloquently. Where do you see this going now?
The Iron Wall strategy is alive and well. And in a new memoir by Ami Ayalon, an Israeli ex-general and Shin Bet chief called Friendly Fire, Ayalon writes, at some point between 1973 and 2002, we were victorious. The victory lay in the decision of all the Arab League states to recognize Israel's existence based on the United Nations resolution. That decision was the reason we fought. Our enemies accepted the fact of our existence in this land based on the conditions we had demanded for years. I'm quoting this not because I agree with Ayalon, but only to show that in the minds of Israeli leaders, Jabotinsky's Iron Wall strategy lives on. Yet the fact is that Israel did not fight in its wars to seek peace, and it has never shown readiness to recognize the Palestinian nation or to give up the territory it occupied in '67 and make peace. There is ample evidence to support this. 2 days after the occupation began, on 7 June 1967, Israel passed Military Order Number 3, in which reference was made to Article 35 of the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Only 4 months later, this article was deleted. Then, in September, the legal counsel to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Theodore Meron, was asked by Prime Minister Levi Eshkol whether building new settlements in the occupied territories would violate the convention. He answered in the affirmative, but the advice was rejected, and the government proceeded from the early days of the occupation to establish illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. From the very beginning of the occupation, the laws in the West Bank were amended to enable the takeover of Palestinian land. The entire system in Israel cooperated in this. The Attorney General, the police, the High Court, all of them without exception. I spent most of my working life investigating, discovering, writing about, and resisting what was happening and warning of the implications of building illegal settlements to no avail. Over the decades, the United States has shielded Israel from diplomatic censure and enabled it to expand its settlements and enterprise without serious consequences. Yet it was not the legal transformation alone that enabled settlement to be built and to flourish. Jabotinsky had written that, quote, settlements can thus develop under the protection of a force that is not dependent on the local population behind an iron wall, which they will be powerless to break down. And so it was. There was also an added component to the transformation of the laws that enabled the settlement project, and that was sheer violence by settlers, vigilante actions that seemed to go against the law Israel had put down and bound itself to. In the early 80s, Al-Haq, the West Bank-based human rights organization, which I was then directing, worked hard to document incidents of settler violence. At the time, we naively believed that if only Israelis knew of what was taking place and the failure on the part of law enforcement agents to stop it, they would take action to prevent it. We were unaware that it was part of the Israeli struggle for the land. The agents of the orderly states do what they can do, and the utter unruly settlers do their intimidation to complete the task and achieve the desired goal. It's all part of the same scheme. Now, settler violence in the West Bank has become a daily occurrence. It is all out in the open, and the government and the courts are on the same page in supporting the settlers and working to achieve the goal of Greater Israel. The Knesset has passed the regularization law, which legalizes settlements built on privately owned Palestinian lands via de facto expropriation. While Jewish settler violence against the Palestinian rages, preventing Palestinians from working their land or using it as their own, with no real attempt by the Israeli military or police to prevent this, Israel calls Palestinian resistance occupation terrorism. Not only that, now the attacks by Israel's army on the passive resistance to the occupation by Palestinians is defined as combat operations. The villagers of Kufr Qaddum were staging weekly demonstrations against the blocking of a road that prevented access to their village. The army planted explosives on roads used by the villagers, but the action was defined as combat operation, rendering soldiers who decided to do this immune from the prosecution for injuries caused to the villagers. With all these victories on Israel's part, the country has now decided that it can manage the occupation rather than end it. The occupation even began to be seen as a national asset rather than a burden. The occupied territories have been turned by Israel into a laboratory for testing weapons and systems of surveillance. Israelis now market their weapons and systems of homeland security to the US and the Gulf states based on testing in the occupied territories. In this narrative of laboratory, Israelis have little incentive to negotiate a real peace with the Palestinians because the lucrative security market has too much potential. Yet all this capitalist investment and the twisting of the laws to serve an illegal project like the settlements and the support of the US evangelists is also destroying Israel from the inside and turning it into an apartheid state. One Israeli columnist, Meirav Arlosor, in yesterday's edition of the Haaretz, wrote that Israel is becoming the Jewish Lebanon of the Middle East. Like Lebanon, it is on the way to becoming a failed state. In Arundhati Roy's novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, one of her characters, Musa, says that if Kashmiris have failed to gain independence from India, at least in struggling for it, they have exposed the corruption of India's system. Musa tells the book's narrator, an Indian, "You're not destroying us, it's yourselves that you are destroying." Palestinians today might say the same of our struggle with Israel.
Thank you, Raja. I just wanted to come back to you. We have about another 7 minutes before questions. Where does this now leave the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian national movement and civil society, that when they see that key Arab states are getting into normalization, you see an American administration giving complete backing to Israeli expansionist plans. What do you think, briefly, the Palestinian leadership, Palestinian civil leaders need to be doing now? What sort of strategy should they take up?
Well, unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority, has sidestepped all the activists other than those who are in the government. And there is little role for people who are intellectuals to have a voice in the administration or in the strategies. And the strategy that the Palestinian leadership is conducting is a failed strategy. The annexation has not happened or will not happen only when they lift the suspension of the de facto annexation, the jure annexation. The annexation has been happening over the last 50 years, slowly but surely and consistently with the building of more settlements. And the possibility that the Arab states would come to our aid has had little feeling or conviction amongst ordinary Palestinians. So it's not really a great surprise that the Arab states are stabbing us in the back, or at least it shouldn't be a surprise. And I think the most important thing that the Palestinians have consistently believed in and practiced is their sumud, their staying put. Israel has had 50 years of trying, or over 52 years now, 53 years of trying to force the Palestinians or encourage them to leave the land. And the Palestinians have insisted on staying put and doing what they can to make their life more livable and to have cultural activities and so on. And that, I think, is the most successful strategy which eventually will succeed, because Israel can only take the land if the Palestinians leave, and the Palestinians are not leaving.
And perhaps I could turn back to Avi, really much the same question. If Netanyahu is not going to be ultimately successful, that annexation doesn't really go forward and the Palestinians aren't land up in some disastrous historical defeat, what is necessary? What should be the strategies of, not just for the Palestinians, but what remains of the Israeli peace movement, for example?
Netanyahu is facing 3 very serious charges of corruption. So his main concern at the moment is political survival, to avoid going to jail. And Donald Trump is facing an election, and he needs these peace agreements in order to Christian evangelists, supporters of Israel, that he has done this for Israel. So we have 2 actors who are concerned very much with their own personal and political interest and with peace in the region. Never ever represented the possibility of peace, because he denies any Palestinian rights. He's a proponent of permanent conflict. He has no solution to this conflict. So the question arises, where is Israel heading to? And the answer is that Israel is already an apartheid state. There was some debate, and there is still some debate by Israel's supporters as to whether Israel is an apartheid state or not. But in fact, I would argue that Israel officially is an apartheid state. The July 2018 nation-state law says that the Jews have a unique right to self-determination, a unique right, which means that the Palestinians have no right, and Palestinian Israelis have no right to self-determination. So Israel doesn't offer a peaceful solution to this conflict, and it has become an apartheid state. And the only... Do
you think there's any way of galvanizing something of a peace camp within Israel that in all of this?
After the collapse of the Camp David summit in 2000, Labour Prime Minister Ehud Barak came back and blamed Arafat when he himself was to blame. And he said there is no Palestinian partner for peace. And in doing so, Ehud Barak destroyed the Labour Party, which barely survives. There is no Labour Party as a real opposition to Netanyahu. And he also destroyed the peace camp, because if there is no Palestinian partner for peace, Israelis vote for a strongman like Ariel Sharon and like Benjamin Netanyahu. So I'm quite pessimistic about the impulse towards change, towards a peaceful settlement with the Palestinians coming from inside Israel. I think it has to come from the outside.
We shall work on that. Raja, very quickly, I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to ask you, the situation regarding human rights and international law, as a lawyer, as somebody been involved in, I mean, generally, globally, it's a very depressing scene. I mean, how do you see that we can actually make sure that these will matter in this conflict and not be ignored as they continually appear to be?
I think the most hopeful possibility is with the International Criminal Court, and work is being done also effectively by Al-Haq in collecting evidence for the court, and work has been done over many years now on this case. Of course, the United States is adamantly stopping and trying to sanction, and has sanctioned the people, prosecutor and the members of the court, and doing everything it can to stop the court from proceeding with its work. But I think if they succeed, then this would be the greatest deterrence for Israel, because You see, the problem is that the human rights has had a shaking all over the world, not only in Palestine. And the things that used to be shocking when we reported on them, which Israel was doing, have now become commonplace. So torture and killings of people from the drones and so on, and are now practiced by the United States and other countries without any objection. So I think that it's still important, the work of the civil society in putting pressure on their governments, eventually to sanction Israel, because that's the only possibility. And that is building up, because there is a change in ordinary people's perception of Israel and the conflict. And so hopefully it will build up to the point when it will begin to have an impact on governments, because so far Western governments who have some power to influence things in Israel have had no role in doing that at all. They just condemn and speak about the two-state solution and the peace process without meaning it, without having any effect, and they know it.
Indeed. Right. Well, we got some questions coming through, and I've got the first one from Shristi, and she asks, from Kelly, and she asks, you have said that the only way to make sense of Israel's senseless war in Gaza is through understanding the historical context. What would you say to those who remain ignorant of the historical context, risk losing, in their view, or interpretation of this war?
The war in Gaza can only be, or Israeli policy towards Gaza can only be understood in a historical context. And I don't have time now to explain the background. So I would just start with the unilateral Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. And that was, as its name suggests, a unilateral withdrawal. So it wasn't an Israeli contribution towards an overall peace. It was a unilateral measure by Israel. And it was a first step towards redrawing unilaterally the borders of Greater Israel. So the aim of the withdrawal from Gaza was to remove 2 million Palestinians from the demographic equation and to stop any contact between the West Bank and Gaza, because the government in Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority, is seen as, by its own supporters, as a collaborationist government that cooperates with Israel in enforcing the occupation. Hamas, which rules over Gaza, stands for resistance. So the point of the withdrawal from Gaza was to isolate Gaza, to impose a blockade, and to prevent any effective national Palestinian resistance to the occupation. So what Israel achieved was, by withdrawing from Gaza, is to turn Gaza into an open-air prison. And Israelis don't have a solution to Gaza or any prospect of peace. The Israeli generals use the term to mow the lawn. So every few years, Israel launches another massive attack on Gaza. And it's not an attack just on Hamas, but it's on civilians. It's the last 3 Israeli attacks on Gaza I would describe as an act of state terrorism rather than a legitimate use of force.
Right, now we have a question from Rohan to Raja. In your most recent book, Going Home, A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation, you describe your journey through Ramallah and the change that the conflict has brought. What to you is the meaning of home? How does one identify home? no matter how changed it may be? And do you believe that a home can ever truly be destroyed?
I think ultimately one carries home with oneself, and my journey to arrive home is to arrive at a certain peace with myself and be able to face my past and deal with my past and deal with the disappointments, because there have been many disappointments for me in the failure of the struggle, and to deal with all of that without being defeated, and to arrive home and feel at one with myself. And so I think home is something that you can carry with you wherever you are, and you can be at a physical home but not be at home. That's very possible.
Right, well, we have another question for you from Sanya Bhutani. And do you believe we will someday arrive at a future that leaves military and religious conflict behind? And if so, how are we to achieve such a thing? Wow, there's a big question for you.
Well, I think that ultimately there are two nations living in historic Palestine, an Israeli nation and a Palestinian nation. And there is no way that one can destroy the other. There's no way that one can destroy the other. And so the only way is to find a way to coexist together and to cooperate in the good of everybody. It's a tiny piece of land that is very threatened, that is not very rich, that is dependent on foreign support, and that is not going to last forever. So we are better off if we find a way to live together and stop this conflict that is making the whole region unsettled. And I think ultimately the point will come when we will do this. I never forget after the Oslo Accords, which I thought were a false peace, how quickly people began to change and say we want to have a better future. The young people who were calling for armed resistance and for violence said, no, we don't want any of this anymore. We want to try another way, which is peace. And I was shocked at this. And of course, they were disappointed because Israel did not live up to its expectations and did not live up to its... Israel has never lived up to any agreement it made with the Palestinians all throughout. And so, as I showed in my little presentation, Israel has been seeking land and colonization of the land and of the people throughout. And it has succeeded in colonizing the land, but not in colonizing the people, because the people are not yet feeling that they are colonized by Israel. The language has not been acquired. The Israeli language has not been acquired. The feeling of Palestinian has not diminished. If anything, it has increased. And so I don't think Israel has succeeded in colonizing the people. And that is very important.
We only have a couple of minutes, so if I could ask you both to be quite brief in responding. Divya Bhatia is asking Avi, how would you say the youth of today is responding to the role of governments and world leaders in conflicts such as these?
Another very big question, and I think that governments are pretty hopeless. Governments have let the people down, and if we narrow ourselves just to the Middle East, then there isn't a single government in the Middle East that has done well by its people. And therefore, I have no hope that American policy, unconditional American support for Israeli colonialism is going to end in the near future. I don't have a hope that European Union would change its support for Israel and its colonial project. The only hope that I have is young people, and not just young people, but reasonable people who believe in justice, in truth and justice. And in particular, it's young people who are supporting BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, which is a grassroots global movement to end the Israeli occupation, which is gaining support and gaining traction. So the hope is young people and civil society and movements such as BDS.
And Raja, another big question for you, and it's going to have to be, I think, the final one. Can war ever be justified?
I haven't looked into the question actually, and I hate wars, but I think if war is truly defensive, it can be justified. But I don't think any of Israel's wars have been justified, and none of them have been really defensive. So I don't think war never brings good results. It brings destruction. So justified in its end result, I don't think it's possible to agree to that. And so I don't think war can be justified ultimately, no. And certainly in the case of Palestine-Israel, war is not going to be the answer.
Yes, I suspect that's probably the case for most of the conflicts that are going on in the Middle East, whether it's Syria, Yemen, Libya, etc. I think we're probably going to have to wrap it up there. I think we've had a fascinating discussion. We've looked at how the Iron Wall strategy has developed over the years, the manner that it was adopted by early Zionist revisionists, and the way in which the creeping annexation is going forward today as we speak, the de facto annexation as opposed to the de jure annexation, which is now for the time being on hold, and whether the Arab world, which for some time really hasn't been backing the Palestinians, whether other countries will join or not, and what does it mean for Palestinians and how they are going to go forward, the vital importance of international law in all of this, and indeed that very positive note, I think, there from both speakers about the role of youth and the future in civil society. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening today. I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to close the session for us.
Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Chris, for that thought-provoking session. I think we had some very big questions at the end, and we would have happily listened for much longer. So plenty for us to think about, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you all at home for watching and being such a wonderful audience. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation UK, and our patron, the Moti Family Foundation, for their support. We hope that you'll stay with us for all of our sessions today, and will join us tomorrow to watch more of our fabulous programme at the JLF London at the British Library. Our next session that will begin shortly is I Saw Myself, Journeys with Shah Abdul Latif, Shabnam Vermani in conversation with Rita Kothari. Don't go anywhere.
I want to start this video with a question. Is poetry important? I assume you wouldn't be watching if you didn't think it was. On the other hand, you might have occasionally had that nagging feeling, thinking about all the time and energy people have put into writing and reading poems for thousands of years. More than that, on a planet full of daily disasters that are both impossibly big and deeply personal, you might wonder, what can poetry do? When these questions arise, someone will often quote the poet W.H. Auden. Poetry makes nothing happen. This becomes a provocation, especially for those of us who feel quite strongly that poetry does make things happen, though we can't always say what. Another poet we might call on is Adrienne Rich, who questioned this expectation that poetry should have direct consequences. Rich says, "To look in a poem for immediate political function is as mistaken as to try to declare immediately what a particular protest demonstration or a picket line has accomplished." Taking this idea literally, Rich's quote makes me think of a particular day in February 2017. In the afternoon, I took this photo at a protest against Brexit outside Parliament. That evening, more than 50 poets gathered in a big shed in South London to read poems in solidarity. Did either of those activities make anything happen? Adrienne Rich shows how complicated this question is. Rather than look for immediate, measurable consequences, she reminds us that the reading or hearing of a poem can transform consciousness. This actually sounds like a pretty major result. The idea that encountering a poem might transform someone's consciousness or a collective consciousness, the way that others think and experience the world. But it's not the sort of thing you can measure in sales figures. The specific context here, a poetry reading which was in support of migrants, refugees, and others affected by the UK's immigration policy, also connects with the poet Audre Lorde's insistence that poetry is not a luxury. For women, writers of color, and others whose mere presence is perceived as a threat to certain ways of seeing the world, poetry's ability to transform consciousness makes it a matter of survival. At the most basic level of language and experience, Lorde says, poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. Poetry creates new possibilities, she says, laying, quote, the foundation for a future of change. And again, this might be hard to measure, but it's quite a big thing to make happen. After that reading in London, the Hungarian poet Agnes Lahosky and I published an anthology of poetry written by and in support of migrant writers. For 18 months or so, we gathered with other migrant poets in venues across the UK and Ireland to read to whoever would listen. When we sold out the first print run, we were able to put all proceeds into a reasonable donation to a charity that helps refugees. But I'm still not sure we can say for certain what poetry made happen in this case. Coming back to where I started, however, it's worth remembering that the overused Auden quote comes from a poem. It's not him saying it directly. And in that poem, which he wrote for William Butler Yeats, it's worth remembering that the line continues. Poetry makes nothing happen, he says. It survives. It survives, he says again in the same stanza, a way of happening, a mouth. And in this way, the poem repudiates its own claim that nothing will happen. The poem itself survives, which in turn becomes a way of happening. These are obviously big, abstract ideas, but I think they can change the way we read or write poetry in practical terms too. When reading or writing, we can consider ways in which a poem is working to name the nameless. We can consider the new ways of thinking opened by its form or by its language. More than anything, we can allow the poem to transform our own consciousness. We can see where it reaches out, where it asks for our empathy. Learning from a phrase by the poet Roger Robinson, we can see how this makes poems into empathy machines. And we can use these machines, and we can learn from the many great nothings that they make happen.